Hello and welcome. I'm Jessica, and along with some other designers and makers, we would really like to have a lively discussion on the impact that craft and design can have as a socially engaged practice. I was lucky enough to be part of ITAC's FORS conference, which took place last September in New York. It was incredibly exciting and inspiring to be around so many artists from such diverse disciplines. However, what I did notice was compared to other areas within the community of teaching artists, there were very few that represented designer makers and their socially engaged practice. So here we are together today to discuss craft and design and its impact it has on individuals, groups, and communities we work with. The current definition of craft by the Oxford Dictionary is an activity involving skill in making things by hand. I am aware that defining craft is another subject for another time, as it carries different meanings dependent on who you are. For this talk, however, I want to explore the relationship of the hand, heart, and head, and the role craft plays in developing these connections. There are so many dimensions to the practice of craft, but for this session, I'll be focusing in on how the sector can improve health and well-being. Since starting out on my journey as a teaching artist, I have seen how effective it is in building resilience, patience, developing empathy, developing resourcefulness, and creating flow. It can provide a platform for building social capital in the form of networks, support systems, and friendships. Craft encourages a multidisciplinary learning process. For example, in jewellery making, you need knowledge of maths and chemistry. It can encourage one to rethink their own knowledge and ways of learning. I, for one, struggled with maths and science at school and now have a different perspective on it due to how jewellery has made me re-engage with it. Craft can cross cultural and social barriers, bringing people together through the act of making. The people I have brought together today have all come from an art college background in design and craft and now work mostly in the field of health and well-being, along with education. We also have Margaret Barron, who will speak about her experience, perhaps, if she wants to, as being a participant in a craft activity, which is really nice as it gives a different angle on everything. The designer makers I've invited are Lisa Arnott, Cassandra Barron, Fiona Herms, Rose Murray, and Sally Price. We're all from Edinburgh, and we're all sitting around our table. We're going to discuss our practices, issues, and challenges around it, and then we are going to talk about the possibility of crafts on prescription. In the meantime, we would love to know what 3 words you would use to sum up your practice. Mine, for example, are colour, time, and curiosity. And if you guys want to type into the chat box, we could explore those descriptions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move on to show you who I am, but we've all met. And that's just my work, my website there. And then I have a lot of my practices now on Instagram. And this is my jewellery, so it's my own kind of artistic expression. And I use lots of metals, quite a lot of precious metals, along with enamel. So I was working as a jeweller in my studio for quite a while, just making jewellery, but I felt quite frustrated because I love working with people and I feel that there's so many things you can teach a person about life through the act of making. So my first kind of job as a teaching artist was to assist a very disabled young man who could barely move any parts of his body due to a degenerative disease. And he basically was determined, as he'd been physically able to till the age of like 9, so he made when he was little, and because of his disease it had prevented him later on going into adulthood of being able to physically kind of execute his ideas and concepts. So I became his making assistant and artist, and that was very challenging in terms of being able to I guess work out a collaborative way of working together, because I'm obviously an abled person. I've got a training in making, and so there was a bit of a kind of exploration of of what could be achieved, and I was very aware of wanting to represent him in his work and not wanting to represent me as a maker. So we found lots of different materials to work with. He could barely move his hands. He was on an oxygen machine, and he was in a kind of very high-tech wheelchair, but he could move his fingers. So we would work with very light materials, and we had to be very inventive. And this is another of his garments. He had a real passion for fashion, and he loved design. So we would work with the kind of light fabrics and paper, and that was in order that he had ownership over what we were doing. It was, and I mean, there's some text here, but he basically, it turned out to be the last year of his life. So there was quite a lot of his illness brought quite a lot of bouts of not being able to come in and make, but when we did, it was, I think, with a great sense of being quite aware of time. So I think that created a real determination between us as a creative team, and I think it challenged both of us in lots of different ways. As I've said, for his project, it was a chance for this project. It was a chance for him to express his creativity, but for me, it was a real realization of what can be achieved when one is flexible and imaginative with materials and methods, and when one is open to any level of creativity. So that was one, and then I got, I think it really made me want to do more with making and people, and I'm currently doing a quilting group with women at the moment, and it's not just about product. I think when you're with people and making, for me, it's much more to do with process and what can be got out of that and what could be created through that. So I will move on swiftly to Lisa, and I will let her have a little chat about what she does.
Hi. So I'm Lisa, Lisa Arnott. I've been working as a teaching artist or social engaged artist for over 20 years in a range of different projects. I started off as a volunteer, and that's when I kind of realised that in a youth project that I wanted to work with people in a community-based setting rather than working as an art teacher in a school, because I really felt that the arts had an opportunity to enable people to voice their views on the world or express themselves in a different way than formal education does. So that led me to go off and study community development, and I've worked in a range of different projects and organisations across Edinburgh and internationally in Melbourne too. But I thought I would share with you the State of Flux project, which was a project that I did in collaboration with an organisation which is called Commas, which unfortunately, because of funding, they no longer exist, but it was a project that I developed as part of my MFA in design at Sheffield Hallam, which is a really kind of progressive art school which encourages and supports artists and designers to engage at a community level as well. The project was to work with women in recovery and look at different ways of enabling them to develop their own self-confidence, and look at how it was impacting on their mental health and their journey in recovery. Hopefully you've seen the film, which, my apologies for the sound, it was done by me and I'm not a filmmaker, unfortunately.
That's great.
But one of the things that they were saying for the women that maybe identified the challenges that they faced was they were working with materials that they traditionally never had access to. So being a jeweler or even engaging with the kinds of equipment, hammers, solders, flames, was completely out of their traditional way of, I suppose, being creativity. It wasn't, they didn't engage with it at school. They had never experienced any kind of making, and I suppose my role currently as a designer maker is, particularly through the work that we do at the studio at Silver Hub, is how do we enable people to engage with the act of making, and in our context it's jewellery, when currently people don't actually have access to those kind of professions, because traditionally jewellery design was a very artisan, working class kind of profession, and we're seeing less and less resources going into those kind of fields at school or in college settings, and I think in the long term that has an impact.
I think that's also because the scene in Britain at the moment is all like service based, it's not skill based.
Yeah, possibly, definitely. So the women that were involved in the State of Flux had never engaged with copper or hammers before, so for them it was very liberating to engage with that, but also it was a level of self-confidence and developing that as you go along, and it did have an impact on their recovery, and hopefully in the film you will have picked up on those elements. We do lots of different other kinds of social engaged practice through the studio. We've supported people who have come through veteran organisations and young carers projects. And for us, it's not necessarily about that they're all going to become jewellers. It's about the process of developing self-confidence, resilience, about belief in themselves, which then become transferable skills into other aspects of their life. And we're not doing this in the term of it being therapeutic, although it has a therapeutic quality. I think the skills that people learn from the project enable them to think about how they can engage at a community level in lots of different ways. So that's what we do. I'm going to stop talking now. And
thank you, Lisa. Next we have Fiona, I think, on this slides. This is Lisa's work.
Oh, that's my work. Sorry, I forgot to say I would say my work is passionate, energetic and thoughtful.
Great.
And this work was developed as a project that I was doing about grief and loss.
Brilliant.
Another
Thank
social
you.
engaged project.
And remember, guys, if anyone wants to type in their 3 words, they can. And then this is the jewellery studio that Lisa runs. And this is the students' work that comes through. And actually next is Kaz, who is a wonderful bookbinder and does a lot of work in community settings, and has quite an environmental stance on what she does. We met through North Edinburgh Arts, which is the arts centre that I'm currently running a project in. And we're actually working today together. I was assisting her on a workshop with a group of women at a health project in an area that's quite what would you say? Quite a deprived area. So it was lovely to see a lot of engagement happening this morning. But Kaz has also, in a former life, you've worked in the arts sector as a voluntary. Yeah. In the voluntary sector.
Yeah. So
here's
history.
Kaz.
So what I'll say might not necessarily match what's on the screen. So do I press down the way? Yeah. So I am trying to think how I came to where I am. So I studied sculpture at art school, and always volunteered working with people. So helped with the local workshop art project at the local gallery. Knew that I wanted to work with people, but didn't want to be a teacher necessarily. I think I come across a lot of people that class themselves as not being creative because that's drilled into them in school, and because they can't draw, that means they're not creative, and that just jarred with me a little bit. So after studying sculpture and knowing that I wanted to work with people, I worked in after school groups. I went away to Canada. I ran an art department for a summer camp in Canada, where I had to be quite resourceful because we're on an island and there was only so many materials I could work with. So it meant that I had to learn lots of different ways to work, and worked with some children that were really into the arts and some children that thought they weren't creative at all. So that was a nice kind of platform for me. When I came back, I went and did a master's in art museum and gallery education in Newcastle, which led to me working at the Yorkshire Sculpture Park in the arts education team, which was a fantastic experience. And ironically, as a result of doing that degree, I realised I didn't want to work in a gallery. It was really nice at the Sculpture Park because I worked with groups of children and adults, and it was very much about being able to touch the sculptures, about being able to run and make a lot of noise and not be quiet and not touch the artwork. And that was really liberating, I think, for me, but also I was telling this story the other day. I often would have a group of children and the teacher would come up to me and say, oh, watch out for such and such, he can be a bit of a pain, so let me know. And those were the children that flourished in that environment, and that was really nice to see, that a classroom environment isn't necessarily the right environment for some people. So I kind of went on from that master's experience realising that I wanted to work in the community rather than in an institution necessarily. And then I lived in a caravan for 6 weeks and worked on a lantern project on the west coast of Scotland, where we were going into schools, community groups, doing willow lantern making. And again, worked with a lot of people that had never done willow work before. And we worked towards creating a community lantern parade. So there was something really lovely about working individually, but then being part of a bigger thing. And
I think that's a big thing about craft, actually.
Yeah, and I think it was an area as well that I think in its heyday was a seaside town. It was a really, sought after place, and it's one of those places that was just a bit left on its own, and there wasn't much sense of community, so this was a really nice way to bring that together. And then, like Jess said, I went on to work in Edinburgh for 8 years with an organisation called Voluntary Arts Scotland, where I was a development officer. So I didn't necessarily lead the creative workshops, but I supported community groups that had a creative element to them. So I'd help them find funding, or I'd help them recruit volunteers, give them ideas about how they might work together and involve more people in what they're doing. But alongside that, I've always had my own practice, which kind of went from big sculptures when I was at art school to making books, because it was, for me, I kind of did bookbinding when I was at art school, but it was making my own sketchbooks, and my sculptures were really big. And then it got to the point where I couldn't make big sculptures, but for me, bookbinding and artist books are almost like portable sculptures.
And is it something to do with kind of the hand-made quality of your projects?
Yeah, completely. So I work a lot with recycled materials. I really like that process of repurposing something. So the workshops that I teach, we often work with discarded materials and create something new out of them. And I think through that process, there's a nice process for people that might feel that they are discarded in some way, that can kind of, it's reflective. I've seen people that feel like they can't make, or they've kind of not found their place, and through the bookbinding workshops, they've
given a new lease of life.
Yeah. So I kind of now teach bookbinding workshops. I do a lot of environmental workshops. I'm working with a community garden at the moment. But what's quite interesting for me is that fine line between a led project and empowering people to lead their own creative group. So a bunch of my regular bookbinders, we have a weekly class, and they really got into it. A lot of them were socially isolated, had ME, and found it very therapeutic to come along to the workshops. I've supported them to establish their own group that now can meet without me, and that's been a really nice journey. And it kind of links in the work that I did through my masters, the work that I did through my work with voluntary arts, and it's just a really nice community that I can be part of now. So that's been a really nice kind of rounding of the circle for me.
That's excellent.
Yeah, I'll stop there.
Kaz. And this is Kaz's Beautiful Books. And where are you there, Kaz? Are you?
I think I'm top right in the photographs, teaching some workshops at, I think that's a community workshop for Community Garden, actually.
Good stuff. Great. And we will go on now to Fiona.
Okay.
Who I met when you were a studio jeweler.
Yes.
And you've developed from there, or you've gone down a different route, or maybe you haven't. Can you speak to us about your practice?
Sure, yeah. I wonder if everyone can hear me okay. Am I close enough to the mic? Yeah? Okay, so yeah, I'm Fiona Harms, as you know. The three words I would choose to describe my work are probably patience, connection, and tactility. So I'm from a jewellery and craft background, so I studied that at art school. I studied at a very small art school called Grey School of Art up in Aberdeen, and because it was quite small, the nature of it was quite mixed media, because it was very easy to pop over to printmaking and maybe try a technique there, even though I was studying design and craft. I then specialised in jewellery making, and I did a master's in jewellery, silversmithing, and related products. And through that, it was quite a fine art sort of course, actually, and it allowed me to, I suppose, make a plan with how I wanted my career to be. And at that stage, I started to think about community projects and this act of making with other people. And I began using a lot of textile techniques with wire, such as knitting and crochet, and also working with fibre to make wearable jewellery pieces. So after that, I was still making jewellery, and I was also starting to do support work to sort of keep paying the bills, really, to be honest, because I find it quite difficult to make enough money to live off of selling my jewellery. So I was working with adults with autism initially. I also was volunteering doing art workshops for a charity called Headway, which is a support group for adults with brain injuries. So, and from there, I just sort of gradually, after a little while doing support work, got a job at a community arts centre. So I was leading, facilitating art workshops, and they were more sort of general. We didn't have a jewellery studio or a jewellery making workshop, and it was adults with learning disabilities. So it was sort of, I taught a range of techniques, but that was also quite suited to me, because I've got a real curiosity about materiality, and I love playing with different materials, and my practice is quite sort of fine art. I in some ways see myself between craft and fine art because of the way I approach my work in some ways.
I think it's quite restricting sometimes to try and box things in.
Exactly, I know.
What, is everyone else, how does everyone else feel about that when their practice is put into boxes, especially with funding? that can be an issue.
Or
Yeah,
just when
because they
it's seen.
require you to often to put yourself in a box and maybe you don't want to be. So I think as makers we tend to be quite fluid and move through.
And even things like awards and funding, it's like if you're an artist and if you're a craft person, those things are mutually exclusive, apparently, which is not true
Which
at all.
they're not. I know that both are involved in both. So from there I sort of began to get freelance art projects, and I've been full-time freelance for a couple of years now, and I've been working with a range of people, but a lot of adults with learning disabilities, women with mental health issues, other adults with mental health issues, women from abusive backgrounds. I've been working a lot recently with older people and people living with dementia. So that's something I've been focused on.
I think that's really interesting, because I'm not sure in other countries, but certainly in Scotland at the moment, there seems to be a big push to do with dementia and creativity. And I feel like dementia and materials work really well together, because there's a huge sensory exploration within that.
Yeah, I think it's really complex, I think, because the reality is dementia rates are increasing, and they're predicted to continue increasing, a lot because of our lifestyles and a lot because people are living longer. There's a lot of reasons for that. But I mean, in some ways it can be very challenging because of, I mean, I've worked with people who are maybe in quite early stages of dementia, so they're being cared for by their partners at home. But I'm currently working with patients who are in a locked ward in a psychiatric hospital because of their dementia, so that is sort of the other end of the spectrum. And I found, you know, the imagination in dementia, and because people can sometimes regress back to their childhood, that kind of childhood playfulness and curiosity can surface when maybe it hasn't in their normal kind of working, living lives from their past.
I think that's a really interesting point, because I think as a child you're encouraged to play a lot and explore.
It's all that art is for you. Creativity is what you should be doing.
And it's never judged how you explore that, whereas when you become an adult, it's like, oh, you shouldn't play, you should get serious.
You don't have time to do that.
You don't have time. And I think that I certainly, when I work with adults, it's almost like you've got to pull out a certain level of playfulness before any of the good stuff can happen.
Yeah, and I just always try as many things as I can, because you never really know what's going to like be the hook for that person onto, you know, something that they can, I don't know, relate or just connect with. Like, for example, recently we worked with a man. The first session I had with him in the group, I was doing various I was working with paper cutters and stamps, and he kept folding up a bit of paper, but I couldn't get him to do any more, to kind of move past that at all, which obviously is fine. But I sort of then continued working with him, and I sort of with these kind of rollers with kind of patterns on them, so you can roll them in the paint, and the same ways you'd roller paint a wall, but I'd paint a pattern. And all of a sudden that was just like, he did about 5 or 6 sort of A2 sheets of paper on this. And then the following week I gave him some chalk and charcoal, and he started drawing these beautiful drawings of buildings with roofs, and he'd sort of repeat the roof a few times. And he was actually a roofer, that was his occupation. But his friend visiting at the time had never seen him draw or be creative, and he'd known him his whole life. This is his lifelong buddy, is sort of like a brother to him. So, and it was really important that he drew the smoke coming out of the chimneys and the roofs, which was really touching as well. So that sort of raises the question, is that craft? Like, I'm a craft maker, and I draw, I like to use chalk and charcoal.
I think to me, craft is, what my own personal thing is if you build up a relationship with material, to me that can be craft. And I think then after that it gets into kind of a bit of a hierarchy of craft. I don't know, but I mean, it would be great to get some kind of feed in from everyone else around. Thank you, Fee, that's great. So sadly, Nicola couldn't be here tonight. She was in Germany. and was delayed. But this is Nicola, who me and Fiona and Lisa were new and as a fellow jeweler. But Nicola has an amazing job. She runs a jewellery workshop for people with learning disabilities. And she's also done other projects. She worked in Nepal teaching trafficked women jewellery, which they went on to sell. So I got her to just send me some her views on the impact of making. She says, I think making has a profound effect on members at Garbled. I try to find an individual approach for each person, enabling them to fulfill their interests and potential, as well as having a common goal and using the craft to bring the groups together socially. In the Garbled Jewellery Workshop, we use all different types of material. Members are able to express themselves through making and take pride in what they have made. What each person gains from the workshop is as an individual as the person themselves. Some people make very little but enjoy the space and materials without producing a finished item.
That's like key within craft work as well, is making a space that people feel like they want to inhabit, whether or not they're going to be creative.
Yeah.
It's like a workup to doing what they want to do as opposed to doing what is they're told they should be doing.
And the process as well, I think, not
the product.
And with adults, again, it's quite difficult to get people to realise that the finished product is not necessarily that important. You know?
I think that's what they get most caught up with.
Yeah, definitely. It's that, I think, when working with kids as well, you realise it's from about the age of 6 to 7, they kind of think, they stop enjoying it and worry about whether or not theirs is the best. You know, and it's something, it must be something that we're being taught, or that we
I think the worst thing in creativity is self-consciousness.
Yeah, but then we all have it. I mean,
that's true.
I've been doing this for ages, and you still get so self-conscious.
Yeah, completely. And next we're going to go to Rose. So here we go, Rose.
Turn it around.
So you come from a textiles background?
Yes, I studied knitted textiles at university in Winchester. While ago now, but I absolutely love knitting machines. I'm quite obsessed by them, actually, but I don't do so much of that now. So I'll give you a little history on me and then explain a little bit about where I'm coming from and why I'm here. Okay, so as I said, I did knitted textiles and then did an MA in knit as well, quite an obsession. And then I went to work for a design studio for about 6 years, and so that involved knitting every day from 9 in the morning till 6 in the evening, coupled with quite a lot of travel as well. But a lot of going around and seeing big fashion companies, but what we would bring to them was something that was made, something that was physical, so they could send that off to the factories to be reproduced, so we would be like a sort of creative injection into their business. So I didn't really see it having so much longevity as a career, so then I went and worked in a much more industrial scale, so worked for a supplier to Next, so that involved more going out to Hong Kong and China and getting thousands of things made. Then I worked for quite a small UK brand called Great Plains, which is part of French Connection, again as a knitwear designer there, so we were making the kind of scale of quantity that I made at Next, but still not so involved in making things with my hands. I would make some samples and send them off to draw some prints, but it was a different kind of work. Then for life reasons, I ended up living in Italy, and while I was there, I carried on doing some freelance design work, but I also started to become a bit more interested in education because I needed to get out of the house, so I started teaching English because I needed to meet people. It was also how I learned Italian, which was really interesting, that I learned by teaching people English that I ended up learning Italian, as my husband worked in an Italian English environment and he really only spoke English, and he didn't get that learning from it. So at the time there was a big oil refinery there, and like any conscious citizen, I would join every Facebook group going with my friends, you know, to campaign about the oil refinery. Didn't really kind of start to occur to me for a little while that I should be looking in my own backyard about the impact of fashion and textiles on the world, and I was quite naive about it actually, and about what a large polluter it is. It's not really getting any better, I'm afraid. I think people are more conscious now, but it's not necessarily getting better. So when I came back to the UK, I went to Leeds and I did an MSc, so I became a little scientist for a couple of years.
it was also quite useful when I was pregnant because I wasn't very well, so it was like quite nice to study rather than work. But I realised after doing it that I wasn't really cut out to, I love science, but I wasn't cut out to work in a lab. So I tried to find what angle it was that I was going to take on this. So I started looking at the question of what is needed in education for a more sustainable textile fashion future. And through that, I did a course in Glasgow where I met Jess, which is why I'm here. And I've just recently been working at a university in England, at the Arts University of Bournemouth, but I've been teaching textiles to the fashion students. So I've been teaching them knit, print, drawing, and sustainability. But I think what's come out of that for me is I went into this research question of kind of what science do they need to know, what skills do people need to know, and I kind of come out of my university experience really interested as well in how we develop the next round of thinkers as well. But I was quite struck by the fact that I taught at a university where people had signed up. This is different to other people at the table. People had signed up and had committed to pay quite a lot of money, because in England the fees are over £9,000 a year to go to university. So with living costs, students could be looking at a debt of £50,000. So you think they'd sort of be quite, actually, because quite a bit of my job, especially with the first years, was to teach the most creative parts and the drawing and the sketchbook. And I thought it would be everybody's favourite bit, and it really wasn't. And it was a real struggle at times. And what we did there was very different to what people had done at school. So even though they'd done art at school, they'd been very much spoon-fed things and were very concerned about whether things fitted right onto the page of the sketchbook, and whether quite a lot of, oh, am I doing it right, was often a question. Will I get my marks for this? You know, and it sort of makes you realise that we've created an education system which is very
target-based.
That's exactly the right words. Yeah, it's very target-based. And even within the sessions where I'd say, well, there isn't a right or a wrong, you're doing a drawing and all we ask is that you attend and you have opinions on your work, that would still, it took quite a lot of breaking down the barriers. So the two images that I've put on the screen here were they're both student work, so please don't use them for anything, not that you would, but just they're not mine. The one on the left was actually when I was teaching a bit in Glasgow, so that was when I was teaching students about drawing, and they were doing a project on dance. So we actually did drawing from the videos of the dances, and that was quite interesting because they were very scared to work on a piece of paper that wouldn't fit inside a sketchbook, so we had to have a lot of conversations about that. And it took quite a lot of breaking down of people's just letting go a bit and not being frightened to do something that might not be right. And then the image on the right is from Bournemouth. So this was one of my students it was printed textiles project, and she really struggled with it and with the idea of what drawing is. And it's still so ingrained that involves a pencil and a white piece of paper, which for me, I'll be honest, often for me it does, and I do draw like that, and quite often, but I do that as a bit of a relaxation thing. So this work was mainly based on like footprints and fingerprints and tearing up pieces of paper and all different alternative ways, and some photography as well, so alternative ways that we could approach what we call drawing. So what I've taken away from that experience is that all students, well, as a country, I don't know if we have many international participants, so maybe you have your own views, we seem to struggle with letting go a bit and being creative and not doing things that are necessarily right. And I'm coming to think that kind of thinking is important for also creating a more sustainable world, for having people who will try businesses that are different, that will challenge things and say, no, we don't have to do it in the same way. We don't have to, that I know that you shouldn't necessarily bleach cotton if you want to dye it black. I know some of the science about that, but they still do it because it's sort of the way it's always been done, which is quite damaging. So by promoting free thinking, I think it's as much as promoting science. But thank you for listening.
Thank you, Rose. That was really great. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's something to be said for drawing and creativity in education as we know it being a kind of means to an end. So it's like bish bosh bash, I've done that. Whereas I think drawing should be about developing a visual language, and any language has lots of different forms within it. So stuff like the mark making that you did is drawing itself. It doesn't have to be
Yeah, it's a tool. It's never a well, it's not often. It's not something that should be like a result.
So I invited Sally along tonight. We met again at North Edinburgh Arts, and Sally does brilliant things with lots of objects and with lots of people. And we first initially met on a programme that is all about arts on prescription. So in the UK, it's being rolled out as a way to combat the kind of, I guess, the conventional methods of prescribing people with antidepressants and you know, all this medicine to do with combating mental health. But instead, the government's pledged lots of money, or some money, to invest in activities in communities that then their patients can go to and have an experience that might create positivity in their lives instead of instead of just, you know, having direct medicine.
Yeah, so it's more of a, it's called social prescribing, so it's more of a it's looking at the idea that being an active member of the community and being an active member, kind of participating in things, can have a really positive effect on people's mental health, instead of treating things more as a medical condition, which often a lot of mental health issues can be treated really medically, instead of looking at more issues to do with social issues and things like that. So I work for well, one of the things that I do is I work for a group called Art in Healthcare, and they're based in Edinburgh, and they set up groups. Well, one of the things they do is they set up groups around Edinburgh, which is the idea is that it's a socially prescribed art group. It's called Room for Art, and you kind of get referred from your GP, or you can self-refer, and it's basically a space to come and take part in some art practices, whether it's something that you have kind of developed yourself and you want a space to do, or if you just want to come along and do something relaxing and creative. But the idea is that it kind of gets people out of the house, it gets people going, gets people to meet new people and take part, really.
And build things like confidence and
massively, and
interpersonal relationships.
Exactly, you know, lots of the groups end up being massive friends and things, and it can be a really positive part of people's weeks, you know, especially if someone's dealing with something that's really really quite difficult in their lives. Having that space, that literal kind of gap in their week for creativity, can have a really, really positive impact. And even though it's not art therapy exactly, it's got a lot of therapeutic and wellbeing benefits and things like that.
But I think it's quite nice that it's not art therapy, in terms of, I think art therapy is brilliant. I also think that sometimes it creates an opportunity to get creative together, and that might not necessarily come from if you were having art therapy.
Yeah, and also you're not exploring definite themes or issues that are happening to you, so you're not necessarily coming in with specific things that you want to explore. It's more of an exploration of enjoyment, really. You know, for some people it becomes an art therapy kind of an experience, but for some people it is just a space in their lives.
It can
for
be
themselves.
A distraction, can't it?
Yeah, or just a time where you don't have to think about all those things that you're struggling with. You just have to look at this plant and draw some stuff you can see, you know, which, you know, for some people is really, really difficult, but once they break through that barrier, it can become such an empowering tool. And that's the same with any kind of creativity, I think, is that once somebody realizes that they can make that choice, they can do something, and there is no right or wrong, they realize that the doors are open for a lot more, you know. One of the projects that I ran for the last couple of years, which I think really kind of embodied this, was called Make Your Mark. You know, somebody mentioned Make Your Mark earlier, which
this is the Make Your Mark exhibition.
I guess it's quite a common title, but yeah, it was a project where the people of Muir House, which is quite a socially deprived area of Edinburgh, came together and made a small scale sculpture. Each person made one or more And it was all about an exploration of materials. That's something that I'm really, really interested in, is approaching things in a really playful way. But they would come together and they would spend time, and it would be a social activity as well. And a lot of the time it would be about just choosing the materials and choosing what to do with them that really helped people take that leap into choosing to do. You know, it's a big difference between choosing to kind of sit back and not take part and choosing to participate. I think that can have a massive impact in communities and in individuals for going on and taking part, choosing to engage in the area, choosing to engage in their families and their own lives, and realizing that they can. I think that's one of the best things that art and craft can do, is giving people the opportunity to choose.
And have agency, I think.
I think that's so important. And like all the groups I've worked with, is giving someone that agency, even if they can't hold a pen, if you maybe or can't use their hands, if you know, you're asking them where they want something put and then put it there, you know.
Well, this one here, the one on the screen just now, which is kind of in focus, it's like a piece of yellow pipe, was made by a woman who was almost completely blind, and we just worked off she was obviously thinking she couldn't take part in this workshop because she couldn't see anything, but we just placed things in her hands until she found things she liked, and we just worked purely on a tactile basis, you know. So especially with craft things, you can use the senses. It becomes much wider than whether or not you can see something, because visual art, obviously people often think it's all about how it looks. That's just not true, and I think craft is one of the most important parts of seeing connection between those things.
I think that's a really interesting point about giving people choice, because when I worked with the young man, I think the way he felt empowered was through having control of what he was planning to do with his materials. And I think it was a very important aspect of his life, because it was about the only time that he had complete control over what was going on. He didn't have control over his illness, he didn't have control over who looked after, you know, to some extent, who looked after him, etc., etc. You know, everything was a bit out of control, and I felt that was one of the best things that was kind of happening through being creative for him, was that it was choice, and it was his choice.
And there isn't a right or wrong element to that, and you know, that's really kind of freeing.
I think one of the key things is also it's having the right space and the right organisations that will support the kind of approaches to craft that we've all taken in different communities. And 3 of us around this table have all worked at North Edinburgh Arts in Muirhouse, and they've got a very progressive way of thinking in terms of how art and craft should be and how it engages with people on a one-to-one basis and in a group manner. Maybe 4 of us have worked around the table at North Edinburgh Arts.
Well, I was going to say that North Edinburgh Arts actually hosted an ITAC